In our last video, we used the business model canvas to describe why students should be interviewing their customers. We also talked about how to motivate your students to actually go out and do those interviews. So if you haven't watched that video yet, go and watch that now. If you have, let's talk about what happens once your students get out of the building and start talking to customers. A couple of the common problems they'll come back with is, first off, they're just having trouble getting people to agree to be interviewed. Or if they're doing their interviews, they're not finding a pattern amongst the problems that they're hearing from their customers. Or they're simply hearing problems that are totally unrelated to the problems that they want to solve. This is all very common, and it's all caused because they're interviewing the wrong customers. So today we're going to talk about which customers your students should be interviewing to get the most out of their interviews. So great entrepreneurs interview their early adopters. So we need to figure out who exactly are these early adopters and how can your students find them. So we need to define who early adopters are. And to do that, we're going to leverage some definitions by Rogers, Moore, and Blank, but we're going to put a little twist on it. And that twist is going to help us find these early adopters. So when we think about early adopters, we want to remember that customers don't buy products. Customers buy solutions to problems. So we don't want to think about early adopters in terms of their relationship to a product. We want to think about early adopters in how they relate to a problem. And by that I mean early adopters are people who have the problem that your students want to try and solve. They know they have the problem that your students want to try and solve. And early adopters are actively seeking a solution to the problem your students want to solve. Now, if your students can find early adopters, this is fantastic news. Because during their interviews, they're going to validate their customer segments. The person they're talking to is their customer segment. They're also going to validate their value proposition. Because the customer is actually going to tell them what problems they're trying to solve. And then your students can use those problems to develop their value proposition. The early adopters are also going to tell your students what their customer relationships should look like, because they're going to leverage the deficiencies the early adopters tell them about of their current solutions. And finally, the early adopters are going to tell them which channels they should use to both acquire customers and to deliver their solution. Because it's the same channels those early adopters are already seeking solutions. Now, this is why the interviews are so powerful. Because when you find your early adopters and interview them, you can validate almost half of the business model. And those interviews will form the basis of your experiments for the rest of the business model canvas. Now, if your students can't find early adopters, that means they're not going to have anyone to provide social proof to the early majority. And so that means they're not going to find anyone who's going to bring on the late majority or the laggards. If your students can't find early adopters, it means it's very unlikely they're going to be able to find product market fit. If they can't find people out there in the world who are actively seeking a solution to this problem, it doesn't mean that the problem doesn't need to be solved. It doesn't mean that the business idea is bad. It simply means the time isn't right to solve the problem now. I mean, if you think about it, if no one in the world is seeking a solution to this problem, now is probably not the opportune time to go and solve that problem. It could be because they're too early to solve this problem, or it could be that they're too late. We don't know, but we know that now is not the right time to solve it. So you can see by trying to interview early adopters, we can form the basis of the business model if we find them. But if we don't find them, it's also good news because we can pivot with confidence. If we can't find people who are seeking a solution to the problem, then we know that your students can go find another problem to solve that's going to be better suited to achieve their goals. So we talked about who early adopters are. Now let's talk about how to find them. Now, when I'm teaching people how to find their early adopters, I like to contrast the early adopters with the early majority, late majority, and laggards. And I usually do that with a case study. Airbnb is a fun one to describe, especially when you go back to the origin story of Airbnb. And remember, to contrast these different groups, we're going to leverage their relationship to a given problem. So the problem that Airbnb was trying to solve originally was that it was too hard to find cheap hotel rooms during a conference. So I start by describing the laggards. Now, laggards are people who don't have the problem that we're trying to solve. These are people who literally don't have the problem. Because they don't have the problem, they don't know that they have the problem, and they're not actively seeking a solution for that problem. So who would be an example of someone who falls into this category? Someone who's attending a conference, but their company pays for their room. Like in this case, this person doesn't have this problem. Maybe they can expense any hotel cost they have, and so they just don't even worry about it at all. Contrast that to the late majority. This is someone who has the problem, but doesn't know that they have the problem. They don't realize it. They're not aware they have the problem. If your students are ever trying to convince customers that they have a problem, the people they're trying to convince are the late majority. These are people they see have a problem, but the people themselves don't recognize that they have the problem. And these are the worst kind of people to try and sell to. Because they're not aware that they have the problem, it is extremely difficult to get their attention just to talk about the problem, let alone try and solve the problem. So it's really important that you educate your students about the late majority. Now in this case, of course, because they don't know they have the problem, they're not actively trying to solve the problem. And an example would be someone who charges the cost of the hotel room to their credit card even though it's a little too expensive for their budget. This is someone who maybe just thinks, this is the cost of doing business, I have to pay this price if I want to go to the conference at all. Compare that to the early majority. And the early majority is someone who has the problem and knows they have the problem, but they're not actively seeking a solution to that problem. Now that could be because the early majority person has already experienced the problem and has searched for a solution, and they didn't find an adequate one. Or they found a solution that was good enough to solve the problem temporarily, but maybe it's not an ideal solution. So in this case, in our example, someone who is an early majority is someone who maybe skips the conference because they can't find a cheap hotel room. They know that the hotel rooms are too expensive, and maybe they did a little looking. They searched for some cheaper hotel rooms on Expedia, but they're just not that interested. They've got other problems to solve, and so they're just going to give up. They're not going to attend the conference at all. Now, the last group, and of course the most important, is our early adopters. These are people who have the problem, know they have the problem, and are actively seeking a solution to that problem. In this case, an early adopter might be someone who's posting on a forum to try and do a room share. Or maybe they're searching all of the hostels in the area to see if they can find an affordable room. These are people who are actively seeking solutions to this problem. And when we look at their behaviors that tell us they're seeking a solution to the problem, that's where we can find them. So in this case, we can find them on their forums. We can find them wherever they're searching for their hostels. Maybe they're posting on Craigslist. We can find them there. And this is the secret to finding early adopters. Now, if your students try and interview anyone who's not an early adopter, that's where they're going to run into the problem patterns that we described before, where there is no problem pattern. Or they're finding problems that they don't want to solve at all because they're unrelated to the problem that they're interested in solving. Because you can imagine if they try and interview a late majority or a laggard or even the early majority, and they ask them, what's the hardest part about going to a conference? Because they're not actively seeking solutions to this problem, or maybe aren't even aware of the problem, they're going to describe other problems, like the food isn't very good, or the speakers are not very good, or the tickets to the conference are too expensive. So we really want to focus their attention on their early adopters, and we use their solution-seeking behavior to tell us where to find them. Another case study that's fun to use is Uber. You can think about the pre-Uber days. The problem they were trying to solve is that it's difficult to find a cab in a big city like San Francisco. So a laggard is someone maybe who doesn't take cabs at all. They ride their bike everywhere. Maybe you present this case study to your students and then you describe the late majority and then have them fill in the blank. Like, who would be a late majority here? Who is someone who has the problem that cabs are difficult to find, but they're not aware that they have the problem. One of the examples they come up with could be someone who takes cabs all the time, but is frequently late. Again, they just take it for granted, and they don't even think that, like, oh, maybe cabs could be faster. It's part of their daily routine. They don't even think about it. An early majority, someone who has the problem and knows they have the problem, maybe this is someone who has a black cab service on speed dial. They don't want to use regular cabs because they're too slow, but they're black cab. They'll pay the extra price, and they're satisfied with that solution, and it's good enough for now. But the early adopter, the person who's actively seeking a solution, this is someone who maybe is reading reviews on Yelp to find the fastest cab service in San Francisco. Or maybe they're leaving reviews. Again, we use their solution-seeking behavior to tell us where to find their early adopters. All right, so we've described early adopters in terms of who they are and how to find them, and that's going to help your students conduct better interviews. They're going to get more interviews, and when they do, they're going to find more consistent problem patterns because they're talking to people who are actively seeking a solution to their problem. And of course, they're going to find problems that they want to solve because they're not talking to the late majority or the laggards. And if they do this, then they're going to form the basis of their business model. And if they still can't find people to interview, well, they're going to have the confidence to pivot to a backup idea that they've generated through their problem generation process. So now you know which customers your students should be interviewing.